Hi, Andrew. Thank you for talking with me. There's a lot going on in our part of the world where we're from, with possible conflict between the United States and Venezuela, and Trinidad is right next door. So this is something that will affect us tremendously. Could you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Well, hi Josh. Thank you for having me on. My name is Andrew Pereira. I am a human rights lawyer and a humanitarian professional with now 7 years of experience working in international protection and national security, dealing mostly with mixed migration movements, countering terrorism, armed conflict, stuff like that. So yeah, I'm happy to be here today. So
Uh, so this is right up your alley, and I think we can get straight into it.
yeah.
So, how do you think, or how likely is a US military action against Venezuela, in your estimation?
Yeah. I think looking at all of the evidence so far, I think it might be more likely than we think. I think there is a high chance where um, the actions that we're seeing that's happening of warships being deployed to our region, aircrafts, some of the threats that are being made are quite telling of what can possibly be coming. I think when we look at how history has sort of influenced these types of standoffs. I mean, we can look at it, 13-day missile crisis, where there was a lot of force and threats being made. I think it's sort of a similar situation. Now, while from a legal perspective, just deployment of warships and aircrafts to the region of the Caribbean, or even Trinidad's compliance with some of the requests of the United States to have their ships dock here and to have sort of like a monitoring base from Trinidad towards Venezuela. While it doesn't amount to exactly a crime of aggression, it definitely to violate any of the the Rome Statute, which codifies international crimes. It would, in as much as amount to a threat of aggression under the United Nations Charter, Article 2, 1. So I think also in most recent times, there was a tweet made by the President of the United States where he's sort of unequivocally closed the airspace of Venezuela. Debate on whether he has the power to do such a thing is there, but even this sort of infringes on the sovereignty of Venezuela. Now, anyone can say what they want, right? Anyone can say a tweet and say, this airspace is closed. I warn all pilots whoever not to fly into this airspace. Doesn't mean it's binding, I should say. However, what will be now amounting to a crime of aggression is if airplanes do still decide to fly over, Venezuelan airspace, and then the U.S. decides to attack anyone who begins to fly into this airspace because of their own warning that they put out as a global warning, then that will definitely amount to crimes of aggression and would be now throwing the region into what we would consider, an armed conflict. So
Right.
yeah,
What about the United States and our Prime Minister Kamala Persad-Bissess's sort of cover story that this is a counter narcotics or counter drug trafficking operation rather than a regime change operation? How does that affect the legal perspective or the legal lay?
so far as we've known, the United States has claimed this area as its backyard. Under their manifest destiny and their big stick policy, they have sort of taken control of this region. So there are conversations on whether the intent of the drug trade is really the driving force behind it, or whether there's some type of economic gain.
Mm.
But as far as I can see from just a human rights perspective, a legal perspective, the way that it's being carried out is a bit problematic or can call some actions into question. As we've seen, there have been attacks on fishing boats that are in the international waters. Whether those boats are carrying narcotics or not, I'm not here to comment on that. But the way in which the force is being carried out is a bit against international law. We would consider an attack like that to be an extrajudicial killing, basically. So whether they are seeking to fight a war on drugs or whether they have other motives, the rule of law needs to be respected. You cannot use military airstrikes against fishing vessels. That is a military action against a law enforcement objective.
Yeah.
International
So,
maritime law gives very clear rules on how to stop boats in international waters through interdiction, through questioning. Military action would be justified in the case of if these boats posed a significant threat to United States national security. But then it calls into question what is national security, how you define national security, and what would justify such a violent attack to satisfy the threshold of a national security threat that will justify moving from a law enforcement action to a military action. When we look at under international humanitarian law, it would require that the threat to the United States has to be military in action or some type of terrorist threat. While I think the President of the United States has claimed some of these narco trafficking gangs in South America as FTOs, as foreign terrorist organizations, it still may not be sufficient to justify the military airstrikes that we're seeing against vessels. So I would remain to the fact that whatever their objective is, whether it's economic or really to put an end to the war on drugs, I would really strongly advocate for the rule of law to be respected, for interdiction of boats in international waters, and for due process to be followed.
yeah.
So yeah,
What what's what sort of mechanisms can be applied by the international community in the event that the United States does not follow international law, if you will?
um,
And how likely, I should say, do any of these mechanisms or are these mechanisms applied? Because I personally can't see the United States facing any consequence for this action. And I become now a little bit skeptical of international law as a concept in of itself. Does it only apply to the weak and the strong do as they will?
I mean, absolutely, it calls into question whether the US will face any real repercussions. There can be calls for prosecution of high members in government, but most likely there will be sanctions. Sanctions usually affect smaller countries with weaker governments that really depend on a sort of symbiotic relationship with the international community. For bigger countries that have a lot of military power, a lot of trading power, whether international law can get these countries to abide is another question. What the international community can do is probably the same thing that has been done throughout history: tariffs, sanctions on trade, um, you know, declarations of persona non grata. Whether that would really affect the superpowers in question is another story.
Or even, I think the question is if they would even do that, but technically those mechanisms exist to
Yeah.
apply to the United States if they go through with this unlawful, if you will, sort
But
of
then again, that will
conflict.
require them having to go to, the UN Security Council or the Human Rights Council and have these discussions where things can be vetoed, where, voting can be stymied and all of these types of things.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I know we kind of said at the beginning that any sort of conflict would presumably be short. But what if the conflict is actually prolonged? How do you
Mhm.
see that sort of affecting the human rights of Venezuelans, of Trinidadians who may be caught up in a prolonged conflict? How does that reshape political stability, the economy, the social cohesion of Venezuela and maybe Trinidad and Tobago, and more importantly, the human rights um, of these individuals, of Venezuelans and Trinidadians who may be caught up in a prolonged conflict?
Yeah. So, I mean, there is already a protracted migration movement or coming out of Venezuela. Any type of prolonged conflict in our region, specifically between Venezuela, between Trinidad, will see, I would say a power split among the government powers in Venezuela and the civilians, right? It will cause much bigger migration movements. As it currently stands, most of the people that are fleeing Venezuela tend to be those in opposition of the current Maduro presidency. Now, if you were to create, let's not create, but if an armed conflict were to begin in the region and it goes on for a protracted period, we always say war doesn't discriminate. It doesn't discriminate against race, against political opinion, doesn't discriminate against, country of origin. Right now, what we understand is the people that remain in Venezuela significantly benefit from their allegiance to the current presidency. If bombs are to drop, like I said, it doesn't discriminate. Those people will also have to flee. It
Yeah.
creates huge migration movements. Trinidad being very close to Venezuela, they might flee very close to Trinidad again. Trinidad is already hosting a number of Venezuelans who are against the government. Now, if we have people who are in support of the government who are fleeing to Trinidad, that is now being supported by the United States, would those people be able to access asylum under international human rights law? They should be able to access asylum, but then would the government of Trinidad and Tobago, with the support of the US, allow those people to seek asylum? Or even if they allow them to seek asylum, would they be given, a fair hearing? Further to that, I think it would have also huge impacts on the United States, as we can see in the work I've done in, refugee status determination and asylum movements. Many people don't consider Trinidad what we would what we would call a final destination country, right? It's not a place where they would see a long future for themselves. Many are resettled to the US, and many may just consider going straight to the US. So I would say a prolonged or protracted armed conflict in this region would see huge migration movements into Trinidad and even bigger migration movements into the United States. Currently, there are migration movements that start from Guyana, go through Venezuela, go through Colombia, sorry, cross the Darien Gap, and go all the way up. And this has been going on for years. I started working in this around 2016, 2018. So since then, this has been a route for migrants to get into the United States. And I think this would only increase the flow of mixed migration. And when I say mixed migration, it's not just asylum seekers, it's victims of trafficking, it's people trying to escape prosecution, it's terrorists. Because, like we said, war doesn't discriminate. So everyone will be fleeing because everyone chooses to preserve their own life, whether they have participated in the taking of someone else's life. So it will cause huge flows of mixed migration, and it will probably be even harder for the US to screen now at their borders who are genuine refugees, who are fleeing prosecution, who may have been involved in acts of torture, who may be, trying to escape all types of things. So I think it will cause a very, very heavy burden on the region, and even including just between Venezuela and Trinidad. You may see a lot of other countries sort of, I don't want to say take advantage of what is happening, but that might also increase refugee movements from, Colombia also, who share borders with Venezuela, from Guyana, may also try to flee to Trinidad, more also try to go to the United States. So I think that would be a huge issue. I could also probably say with protracted situations of conflict or violence, you would see higher increases of violations of human rights, exploitation. People may be now capitalizing on more smuggling, people may now be capitalizing on more human trafficking, um, child labor, all of these things. And I can just see that this would have very, very heavy effect.
There will also be a lot of human suffering, which I think that we need to highlight. We obviously don't want that, but war means suffering.
Yeah.
Um, do you have a number of how many Venezuelan refugees or immigrants currently have left Venezuela?
Off the top of my head, no. But I do know it's in the millions. The last I checked, it would have been the second biggest migration movement in the world after the Syrian refugee crisis.
Wow, so it's a lot. And what about how many refugees or migrants in Trinidad? Do we have numbers for that? Do we even know,
Uh,
does Trinidad and Tobago know how many refugees are currently domiciled in Trinidad and Tobago?
well, not to be like extremely particular, but the number of refugees that are in Trinidad, we would know, what the UNHCR would know, because to receive refugee status, it's a legal administrative process of going through a hearing, having your case adjudicated, and then being declared a refugee. Now, it's important to understand that not every migrant or Venezuelan who enters Trinidad would approach the UNHCR to request asylum. Some may not even know it exists. Some may not be aware of the process. Some may not trust the process. So definitely the number of recognized refugees, as in those who would have approached the UNHCR, those who would have had their case heard, adjudicated, and declared refugees, um, would be significantly smaller than the number of persons who are actually in the country. So yeah, I think it will be. I think now it may be a bit less because also, after you're recognized as a refugee, you may be able to be resettled. So a lot of Venezuelan refugees may have been resettled, but that doesn't, you know, omit the amount of unregistered Venezuelan migrants in Trinidad.
Yeah. So we're looking at anywhere from 30,000, 40,000 to maybe 100,000 Venezuelans currently in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes, there was a statistic that the UNHCR had released to the government maybe in 2019 or 2020, um, of the numbers of recognized refugees and probably persons who would have just registered with them. And I think it was definitely in the big thousands of numbers. Um, Now a lot have left and gone on to different countries. Some have tried, some have gone to Spain. So the number may be a bit less, but I do think there is still a very huge number.
Yeah. I mean, it calls into question a sudden humanitarian surge while balancing its, commitments or its involvements with the US.
That becomes a question of international human rights obligations versus diplomatic relations. And we see in this arena that these two are always at odds. How do you uphold your national sovereignty, or what one considers their national sovereignty, with the international obligations? It's a fair point where I hear a lot of conversations surrounding Trinidad being a small island Caribbean state, being almost unable to house the number of Venezuelans that they presume can migrate to here. Valid questions, but again, international human rights law would require you to. Everyone has a right to seek asylum, right? Whether they are given refugee status is a bit different, but they have a right to approach a country, explain that their life is in danger, and have their case heard. Now, due process would oftentimes influence a lot of the outcomes of refugee status determination. And this is where we can see a bit of a blurring of someone's national interest of allowing people to seek asylum and access asylum procedures, but then reject a lot of cases and deport them. And this is often used as a tool in many different countries and asylum procedures where they uphold their human rights obligation to allow people to seek asylum, but then they would reject a lot of the cases because of probably alliances that they have in the international community or because of their own religious biases and stuff like that.
Do we have the infrastructure in Trinidad to manage, let's say, 100,000 Venezuelan refugees, or we don't have the infrastructure?
I would say yes and no. As it currently stands, I don't think the government of Trinidad and Tobago has the skill set to really screen and process, any type of asylum claim, because this was being done by the UNHCR before. There were conversations. I know there is not the capacity right now for the government of Trinidad and Tobago to process asylum claims, but I do know there are capable people in Trinidad who, if they were to collaborate with the government, produce extremely good screening tools, extremely good asylum procedures, that it would be possible to process and facilitate the asylum claims and sort of sift through what we would consider, people who are genuinely in need of international protection and people who may be abusing the system for economic reasons or whatever else it may be. And it's just to draw a very clear line of, refugees and asylum seekers should be given a different legal priority to just general migrants.
And so, what sort of tools are there to prevent, let's say, cartel members and these armed groups from being able to take advantage of the refugee process?
Yeah, so that's where it will come down to capacity and skills of the individual, right? You would be ideally, because I did refugee status determination specifically for refugees who would have had, some type of criminal association or background or involvement, and it really takes strong screening, targeted questions, and first port of entry is your strongest point of identification. Sorry, and from there you would know how to triage who would require genuine international protection and how do you filter out these specific individuals who may be trying to abuse the system. And from there, once you filter these individuals out, then the government can take an action to either, implement universal jurisdiction and prosecute them for whatever type of crimes they would have committed elsewhere, or deport them or have them in some type of administrative detention within due parameters.
In your estimation, let's say, like, okay, I feel like one thing that I have noticed, and I will say this over and over and over and talk to as much people about this, is that I find after viewing the reaction in Trinidad and Tobago to possible conflict, it almost seems performative in nature rather than it really dawning on people that there might be real war essentially right next door.
Mhm.
Um, Whether or not it is a short war or a protracted war is still up in the air. Outside of your speciality, can you make a comment on whether or not you think that Maduro will be removed quickly, or will we go to the dark scenario where there's a protracted conflict in your estimation?
I do think it's unlikely to be quick, even with overwhelming firepower. I do think he has strong protection within his country. He has a lot of paramilitary groups. He has a lot of loyalists, let's say, who would help protect him. One can look at history of Maduro. He's been in power since Barack Obama's second term, I believe. Would have been there through Trump's first term. Would have been there through Biden, and now he's there again through Trump's second term. He has been there fixed for a very long time. Now, argument of whether former US governments are trying to do it the legal way and diplomatic way, sure. Now, this time around, we may see US governance to be a bit more aggressive, to be a bit more willing to flout legal procedures and international law. Maybe it can be rapid in that way if international law and just the general rule of law is flouted. Maybe they may be able to remove him rapidly, but it seems to me if they decide to do it a bit more to the book, it may be a bit harder to remove him. I think he has a strong security architecture, like I mentioned. He has the Obiopoli Colectivos and the Bolivarian Guard and all of the compartments that make up, the intelligence service, like the Civil and all of these groups. And I think there's some sort of loyalty to him from those people who he's managed to keep in his cabinet. Also, the Venezuelan citizens who are there are also calling for peace. And while they do not wish to see Maduro in power, I think they also oppose US imperialism. And there's this quote that I always remember. And it sorts of talk about like when your identity feels at threat, even you will begin to support your oppressor, right? So now they are now moving in a way to support Maduro, just to back Venezuelan sovereignty, not because they support him, but because they feel like their identity is a threat and they don't want US imperialism. Now, that can be misconstrued as some sort of, support for President Maduro, for him not to resign, for him to protect Venezuela, because at this point, they may feel like that's all is left to protect Venezuela. And then there may be others that feel if they so cared about the Venezuelan population, why have they not made any moves? Right? Canada never made any moves. Australia never made any moves. France never made any moves. No one has made any significant moves to try to help the Venezuelan population and attempt to remove their current sitting president. Only the US so far has, regardless of the motives why the US may be trying to do that. They are the only one who's attempting to do it. Yeah, as far as it stands, I do think it may not be as rapid as we may think, but this current US government tends to be flouting a lot of procedures, so who knows?
And international norms. Definitely not a normal regime there
Yeah.
in the United States. Whether or not you like him or not,
Yeah.
it is definitely not normal times. Given these challenges and the risks, specifically as it relates to human rights and international law,
Mhm.
how should Trinidad and Tobago navigate this moment?
in what regards navigate what moment in upkeeping the international standards in the best interest of the population and the interest of national security in what way?
Both.
I think what would be of interest is transparency. The government of Trinidad and Tobago should be transparent with what is happening. I understand there are agreements, US, what's it called? Is it SOFA and the ACSA,
Hmm.
where they are training local enforcement and logistics and intelligence sharing and all of that. So I understand they need to keep those contracts or keep those agreements abide by national security. But I also do think there is some type of duty to your population. And if the population is asking for reassurance,
So
yeah,
you would say that Trinidad and Tobago has a lot of work to do in terms of preparing itself for a possible prolonged conflict, specifically regarding making sure that international norms and international law is upheld. And there's maybe some sort of gap in that regard with the current government.
exactly. I mean, right now, I saw this comment on social media the other day. It's like when rain falls, we can barely even, handle ourselves.
Yeah.
So we are underwhelmingly prepared for any type of armed conflict right now in this region. It is a bit worrying because if strikes are made against Venezuela, we don't think Venezuela would retaliate against the US. They'll retaliate most likely from where the strikes are coming. If the US has a base here, they're striking from here. Retaliation attacks would be launched to Trinidad, and we definitely, at least I definitely don't think Trinidad is able to withstand any type of armed conflict. Humanitarian crises, not even if banks are attacked, if
Health
hospitals,
centers.
yeah, yeah, sorry. If health centers are attacked, I definitely don't think we would be able to withstand any of that. In terms of like balancing our priorities of international obligations and all of that, I do think there needs to be an emphasis on humanitarian neutrality, as in if it's an international armed conflict under international humanitarian law, it needs to be clear that who is doing the actions, and if Trinidad is just being used as territory, but I mean, even though that will still make us lawful targets on the IHL, but to be clear that you know it's a war between interest of the United States and Venezuela.
Right.
So,
Things are
sorry.
things are moving so quickly. I mean, day to day, there is a new event, a new happening going on, specifically between, Venezuela and the United States. So
Mm-hmm.
in one sense, how could we prepare for such a dynamic situation when we don't know what will happen tomorrow or where this is going tomorrow? And I think that is also a massive challenge for our current policymakers is being able to think two, three steps ahead at possible scenarios and outcomes and being able to prepare simultaneously for all of those outcomes. And this is where I see that there is a huge gap looking from where I'm standing regarding Trinidad and Tobago's preparedness, um,
Yeah,
in the event of armed conflict. The ideal situation for Trinidad would be that it's quick, right? It's a 12-day kind of conflict. Maduro's out.
yeah,
Um, but it may devolve into a longer term scenario. And in that sense, Trinidad and Tobago should prepare itself for that possibility. And that would mean proper communication to the population regarding possible scenarios, what may happen, what may not happen, and how to prepare in the event that something protracted does end up occurring. And unfortunately, that's
yeah,
not what I'm seeing, right? I'm not seeing this um, preparation of the public for any sort of conflict. Does the United States do we fall under a US security umbrella during the conflict itself? Do thousands of soldiers police our skies, our cities, our banks, our hospitals? Or does Trinidad and Tobago have any sort of role in protecting ourselves in the event of a breakout? And unfortunately, um, you don't see that happening, which I think is really unfortunate. And it kind of goes to what I was saying about a lot of the outrage being performative rather
Hmm.
than it being actual fear
Yeah,
that leads to this sort of contingency planning. And that I think is really unfortunate. So, and
and I
something
do
that we
think,
have to be worried about.
and I do think a lot of the response should not be performative because I do think there is a real possibility that this region can be thrown into an armed conflict. So I 100% agree that rather than doing these performative types of protests or statements, it should be more of what we would call early warning type of preparation. Like
Right.
we're seeing the signs, we can identify, we should take preemptive action of like, okay, if this is to happen, what is going to be this? What is the government's
Right.
response to this? If the government of the United States decides to launch a airstrike against Venezuela or a ground incursion does happen and retaliation begins to happen, what is the strategy that we're going to take from there?
Right.
Then how is international humanitarian law going to be applied in the case of Trinidad and Tobago? How is international human rights law going to be applied in the case of Trinidad and Tobago? Who is going to be called to defend the country? Would Article 51 of the United Nations Charter be engaged? All of these questions, the governments and also CSOs, I would say, should be trying to work on to provide some type of contingency plan for the citizens of the country. Right now, it's what I would say a lot of fear mongering and a lot of silence. And
Yeah.
silence also leads to fear mongering
Yeah.
because if there's a gap of silence, people begin to create their own theories and then there begins to rumors start spreading and no one knows what's happening. I
Yeah.
think there needs to be extremely serious, clear communication and transparency in what is going on. If there's going to be um, a draft to military service. I mean, um, who's going to be called, in what way, how is IHL going to be executed, how are civilians going to be protected, what are lawful military targets, what are safe, zones for citizens to go. Usually under IHL, it's schools and hospitals, but a bomb drops, you never know.
Yeah.
While ideally, combatants are not supposed to be targeting, you know, civilian infrastructure and objects, it still happens, right? Collateral damage is a cost of war.
Yeah.
Death is a cost of war.
Yeah.
So,
So
what
I
is
think
some?
that's it's
Mhm.
a good place to lead, I think, the conversation.
Yeah,
Where are the safe zones? In the event that there's a conflict that happens, because I think we need to think about the practical sort of next steps in the event that there is war.
yeah.
According to international law, where are safe zones for civilians to evacuate to in the event of armed conflict?
Yeah. So usually under international humanitarian law, civilian safe zones would be usually schools, huge residential buildings, usually high-rise residential buildings, underground bunkers, which I don't think Trinidad may have, um, hospitals, and any other type of healthcare center. I do think a huge humanitarian crisis and the migration movement would start. Does Trinidadian nationals have the know-how on how to, plan a escape strategy? I would probably put that more at the forefront of what people or families should be talking about rather than trying to find a safe house. Because
Right.
ideally, when we look at conflicts in other countries, most migration just goes. They're connected by land borders, so they flee to the nearest land border, and they might continue on to somewhere else. But Trinidad is surrounded by water. What is the escape strategy? What is the contingency plan for those who may not be able to flee and are trapped on the island, may not have the resources to flee? If a bank is attacked, you may be left without money. You cannot flee on foot. Like all of these are conversations that should be happening,
Right. But they're
if
not.
not at the government level, within families, within NGOs, within CSOs, on really structuring some type of
Escape
contingency
plan.
plan.
Yeah,
Yeah,
contingency plan. And yeah, I mean, this is what we're not seeing. And I think that's this sort of capacity building or contingency planning, as we say, is needs to be a bigger part of the conversation. And that is what is really, really, really worrying me about what is going on right now. It's almost like we're just like ignoring the possibility that what might actually happen. And if it is that
Yeah.
but it might, right? The likelihood of it happening is above 0%. And as a result, we should be planning for like what to do in the event that it happens,
Mhm.
right? Like how do people behave in such a situation? Like
Yeah.
panicking and panic buying, is that useful to do? Where do they run to? Where are the safe zones? How do you
Mhm.
seek medical help? What about
Yeah.
early warning, right? We don't have sirens in Trinidad and Tobago that would warn us of an incoming missile. So
Mhm.
presumably we'd be relying on radio and the television and the
Yeah.
internet for this sort of early warning of any incoming strikes. And typically in armed conflict, those are the first targets by
Yeah.
aggressor countries or third countries. So, Venezuela presumably would take out those structures or that infrastructure first. And in that sense, immediately Trinidad is dark and there is immediate panic, right? So where are those early warning systems, those sirens being installed? So that the population could be made aware. And unfortunately, we don't see it. We don't even see the infrastructure being built to provide those
Yeah.
sort of communication that would be necessary.
And there would also be some type of question in regards to, you know, what type of benefit is Trinidad getting from this collaboration with the United States in terms of if a war is to break out, would the US host a specific number of Trinidadian, refugees? Would they be willing to open the doors to Trinidadian refugees? Kind of like what we saw with Afghanistan when a lot of Afghani civilians helped, the forces on the ground, and then they were able to seek asylum in the U.S. Through specific special procedures because of their collaborative effort to dismantle the Taliban there. So I think transparency would also be good for kind of civilians to understand what benefit is this to our nation, as so far as just most people see it bringing war into a region of peace. Um, but it would be good to know what is the benefit to, you know, Trinidad and Tobago in supporting this war.
I guess we will see if Kamala's gamble pays off or not. I think that's a good place to stop the conversation. Thank
Yeah.
you. So, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me.